Good morning. I call this hearing to order. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this joint hearing between the Economic Opportunity and Technology Modernization Subcommittees. Today we'll be reviewing the VA's implementation of the Colmary Act, also known as the Forever GI Bill. It has been almost 2 years since Congress passed the Forever GI Bill into law. Questions remain about the Department's implementation, particularly of Sections 107 and 501, which changed the allowance for housing benefits veterans would receive. VA contracted with Booz Allen to make essential major modifications to its information technology systems that processed education claims and payments. However, in July 2018, with just 1 month to go, it became clear that the August 1st deadline would not be met. In the fall 2018 semester, student veterans faced long delays in payments, with some news reports stating that several student veterans were getting evicted from their living situations because of the delays. Clearly, these modifications have not gone smoothly. In November 2018, the VA announced a reset of its implementation efforts, indicating that implementation would occur by December 1st, 2019, for the spring 2020 semester. That led to the VA signing a new contract earlier this year with Accenture, since which time we had closely tracked implementation, as we continue to do today. In this committee's previous hearings regarding the President's budget request and our field hearing in San Diego, we examined shortfalls in the Forever GI Bill execution. Repeatedly, we've asked VA officials if the resources they're allocating today and requesting in the future are sufficient to deliver our nation's veterans the benefits they have earned. Both Ranking Member Bill Arrakis and I have expressed doubts that the Department will be ready by its new deadline. While we have received promises of confidence from the VA, it is this committee's duty to exercise oversight authority over the law's implementation. That brings us to today's hearings and our witnesses, and I thank you all for being here. We're fortunate to have experts with the VA Office of the Inspector General, and the MITRE Corporation. The Inspector General conducted its own assessment of the Forever GI Bill and implementation, as well as requesting that MITRE conduct an independent technical assessment. The IG's findings were stark. The VA lacked an accountable leader who could oversee project delivery, and I quote, resulting in unclear communication of implementation progress and inadequately defined expectations, roles, and responsibilities of the various VA business lines and contractors involved, end quote. Our opportunity here today is to see where things stand and learn from the failures of the past. I look forward to hearing the testimony from our witnesses to determine where we should be focusing our efforts. And with that, I now recognize Technology Modernization Subcommittee Chair Lee for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Levin. I'm pleased that we could hold this joint hearing today. Ensuring that student veterans get the benefits they've earned and that the Department of Veterans Affairs has the systems capable of delivering these benefits is at the heart of both of our subcommittees' work. The subcommittee that I chair, the Subcommittee on Technology Modernization, has a broad mandate to look at the systems big and small and to conduct oversight on how the VA is trying to modernize these systems. One question I have is, what does the universe of legacy systems look like? I want to try to get a handle on that answer today. I'm also very concerned about the VA's ability to successfully move from legacy to modern systems. This is not just because the VA faces challenges like every federal agency with keeping up with the pace of technology and prioritizing programs and budgets. It's because the VA seems to manage to get in its own way time and time again. Leadership vacuums, mismanagement, and an over-reliance on contractors makes it hard to succeed. It is good to have lessons learned, but unfortunately you had to fail to get here. Management has to lead, but in the case of the Forever GI Bill implementation, management was absent. No one was in charge. A lack of accountability, a lack of governance is not just a Veterans Benefits Administration issue, it is a whole of VA issue. I'm troubled by governance issue in IT implementation across the department. It's especially concerning in one of VA's biggest IT investments, the electronic health record modernization. We have been asking repeatedly for VA and the Department of Defense to provide information about their governance proposal for months, but all we hear is crickets. Meanwhile, the program continues to move further down the track and millions of dollars are being spent. Building a house on a shaky foundation has real risks, and a lack of governance is going to be a problem down the line. I hope the rest of the VA leadership will look at what happened with the Forever GI Bill and see an opportunity to make improvements to the way other IT programs are being implemented. And I hope that today's discussion will spur the VA to do more to get a handle on this governance problem before we hear of yet another IT failure at VA. I'm sure at the witness table you all are cognizant of this. But I want to be clear that IT failures don't happen in a vacuum. These IT failures mean that veterans don't get their benefits, they get evicted from their home, and have their education disrupted. These failures have real consequences for our veterans. I thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. Thank you. I yield.
Thank you, Chair Lee. I now recognize Economic Opportunities Subcommittee Ranking Member Bill Arrakis for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very much. I'm proud to be here today to be part of the subcommittee's continued review of the implementation of the Forever GI Bill. The Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity was the only committee on the Hill to hold any hearings on the implementation of this law last Congress. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for continuing to examine this vital program. As I mentioned at our hearing last week, the failure by the VA to update their IT systems caused massive delays in processing GI Bill claims for thousands of student veterans last fall. For many student veterans, these payments are the only source of income they have while they are in school. To those who have tried to downplay the financial impact and stress these delays placed on these veterans, I ask you to go weeks, if not months, without a paycheck and see how that impacts you. At our subcommittee hearing last week, Dr. Lawrence's top deputy, Ms. Devlin, testified that she was completely confident that VA had turned the corner and would meet their new self-imposed deadline to fully implement Sections 107 and 501 of the Forever GI Bill by no later than December 1st, 2019. While I certainly want to believe that the IT modification will be ready, I know Mr. Banks has some specific thoughts and questions on the system itself. I wouldn't be doing my job if I wasn't just a bit skeptical of this promise by the VA. After all, last year, these same types of assurances have been given to this subcommittee time and time again. Now, I don't begrudge the VA staff working on this problem, as I know many of them are some of the most dedicated employees in the department. But I do hope that our witnesses will testify about the lessons they have learned and that they are ready to show us why the results will be different this year. Today, I'm also looking forward to hearing from our witnesses about what their plan will be on when and how to make students whole who were underpaid since August 1st, 2018 deadline set forth in the law. I agree with Dr. Lawrence's intention to ensure these retroactive payments don't impact the processing of current housing payments, but students should expect to be paid as soon as possible, not just when it is convenient for VA and the schools. I also look forward to hearing from VA's witnesses about their plan for communicating how these IT modifications and implementation of the law will impact students in schools. Despite VA's best intentions last fall, many students were left unprepared for the delays and still do not understand how the changes will impact them and their monthly budgets. Finally, I look forward to hearing from Assistant Secretary Jiffer about what investments have and will be made to upgrade aging IT systems for GI Bill processing. Many of the delays last fall can also be linked to an ancient IT system not being able to communicate with one another due to bandwidth or other issues. Mr. Chairman, the delays last fall were certainly not the first time the VA has failed to provide GI Bill payments on time, but we must do everything we can to ensure that such delays never happen again. Our student veterans deserve better. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Finally, I recognize Technology Modernization Subcommittee Ranking Member Banks for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. VA's struggle to implement the Forever GI Bill is not primarily an IT story. This is a story about student veterans pursuing their educations, paying their bills, and living their lives. I know that is not lost on anyone in this room, and my colleagues have described this eloquently already. But nonetheless, it is important to say before anything else, because IT problems in an organization as large as the VA have real-world consequences. These particular IT struggles with LTS, VA Once, WEAMS, and other systems concern me not because they're unusual, but because they are so ordinary. This disaster happened with 2 sections of the Forever GI Bill, but it could have been any VA program. What were the risk factors? Antiquated legacy systems, complicated interdependencies between the systems, uncertain requirements, many data feeds from different databases. That could describe nearly every situation our subcommittee has ever examined. Going forward, I think VA has to approach every project with the assumption that it is high risk. Any IT system on a decades-old platform that has not had a major modification in recent memory is going to be fragile. When you try to integrate it with something new, it is probably going to break. Let's go in with some of those assumptions. Let's do the IT assessment at the very beginning, when VA is figuring out its business requirements that the IT systems are supposed to support. I hope those can be lessons learned. But right now, VA is facing another end-of-year deadline to modify LTS to accommodate the housing allowance changes. We have the benefit of a year of trial and error, as well as MITRE's independent technical assessment and the Inspector General's report. We have Undersecretary Lawrence as the single accountable official. We have a streamlined team of VBA and OIT professionals, and we have the attention and support of the highest levels of the department, and that is all very good. But we also have all the same legacy IT systems with the same complicated interdependencies. VA still has no end-to-end software testing process, test data, or common platform to test the new code against the various systems before putting it into production. The contractor is going to write all the code in increments according to the Agile methodology. That's good. But the testing environment will not be in place, even under the best-case scenario, until the very end, and that's bad. Even though the code will have been written in increments, it will have to be tested all at once and then put into production quickly. There is no reason to doubt that will happen, but it will be just in the nick of time. In other words, VA has some of the ingredients, and it's trying to get the remaining ingredients, but most of them are not in the sequence the recipe actually calls for. I believe the level of scrutiny this committee has devoted to the Forever GI Bill is absolutely warranted given the importance of the law and its impact on student veterans' lives. And I believe the level of priority that the VA has given to this issue is in part the result of that scrutiny. Our esteemed witness panel here today is evidence of that. We have the benefit of hindsight and some of the best minds at work from industry and government. Let's make this time different. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Now I'd like to turn to our witnesses. Appearing before us today is Dr. Paul Lawrence, Undersecretary for Benefits at the Department of Veterans Affairs, who's accompanied by Ms. Charmaine Bogg, Acting Executive Director of Education Services at the Veterans Benefits Administration, Mr. James Jaffer, Assistant Secretary for the VA Office of Information and Technology, and Mr. Robert Orifici, Information Technology Specialist for Architecture, Strategy, and Design at the VA Office of Information and Technology. We also have Mr. Michael Missel, Inspector General of the Department of Veterans Affairs, and Mr. Jay Schnitzer, Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of the MITRE Corporation. Thank you all for joining us. As you know, you'll each have 5 minutes, but your full statements will be added to the record. Undersecretary Lawrence, you're now recognized to present your statement.
Thank you and good morning, Chairs Levin, Lee, Ranking Members Arrakis and Banks, and members of the subcommittee. We appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the positive progress VA is making on implementation of the Forever GI Bill. On November 28, 2018, VA announced key changes in the implementation of Sections 107 and 501. Because of the information technology difficulties VA experienced with implementing these sections, Secretary Wilkie announced a reset of VA's implementation efforts to give the Department time, contracting support, and necessary resources to develop the capabilities to process enrollments in accordance with the law by December 2019. Considering the IT challenges we faced in late summer, we did not update the monthly housing rates in August as would normally occur. Within 2 weeks of the Secretary's announcement, we took swift action and updated the 2018 and 19 academic year monthly housing rates for fall 2018. By the end of January, we processed over 450,000 corrections. As a result of this accelerated and aggressive timeline, over 322,000 individuals received additional funds they were owed. I'm also pleased to report that our pending education claims went from a high of 200,000 claims in September 2018 to the lowest it has been in months at under 65,000 claims on April 22, 2019. Our pending inventory is slightly above 67,000 claims as of May 8th, and our average current days to complete is 25 days for original claims and 13 days for supplemental claims. We are on track to meet or exceed our fiscal year targets of 28 and 14 days for processing original and supplemental claims, respectively. In early fall, VA engaged MITRE to perform an independent technical assessment of the capabilities necessary to meet these requirements. MITRE provided 20 recommendations intended to help us successfully implement the Forever GI Bill. We have completed 10 of the 20 recommendations as of April 30, 2019. An additional 9 recommendations will be completed by June 30th, and the remaining recommendation will be completed on September 30th. The approximate cost to conduct the ITA was $232,000. In December, VA again contracted with MITRE to support and address the recommendations set forth in the ITA as they pertain to the Comeriac Program Integration Office. The value of this one-year contract is approximately $5.2 million. In preparation for the arrival of the software development and systems integration vendor, we established the PIO as the formal entity within the department with assigned or aligned government leaders, staff, federally funded research and development center support, and contract support. This governance structure, which is supported by the MITRE Corporation, is to serve as the decision authority for the definition and enforcement of norms for executing program activities and approval or disapproval of lifecycle processes, control gates, activities, funding, acquisition, resources, and the systems required to achieve successful implementation. MITRE also coordinates functional, technical, and programmatic activities, capturing associated risk with these activities, and developing mitigation plans and strategies to ensure we are on schedule to meet the December 2019 implementation date. On February 15, 2019, we awarded a contract to Accenture Federal Services to provide systems integration to coordinate planning, development, and integrated testing of all systems associated with Comeriac implementation. The approximate value of that contract for fiscal 2019 is $14 million. The scope of their contract includes development of new software, interfaces with legacy systems, system architecture, and testing. Accenture and VA started working on implementation efforts the same day the new contract was awarded. Accenture has already analyzed the code delivered by Booz Allen Hamilton against the Section 107 and 501 requirements, concluding it will not be utilized as a starting point for Accenture's own development efforts due to definition changes under these sections. Accenture, however, will evaluate the available code delivered by Booz to determine if any portions of it can be reused within Accenture's own development under a support contract. VA has made great progress in setting course for successful implementation of the Comeriac while reducing the claims workload and improving timeliness to ensure our student veterans are paid without delay. Last year, the regional processing offices experienced significant latency issues that impacted operations. So we increased bandwidth at all 3 RPOs. The increased bandwidth at Muskogee RPO resulted in an increased capacity by nearly 50%. To further address this latency issue at Muskogee, we replaced over 500 user workstations to resolve issues with outdated network cards. In addition, the benefits delivery network system performance was improved by deploying a patch to 1,887 workstations. We continue to work closely and collaborate with OIT on technology improvements that support our field stations and our staff processing education claims. We also increased our efforts to communicate and disseminate information widely. In this regard, we have undertaken numerous initiatives to better serve and inform our stakeholders, including emailing updates to approximately 700,000 veterans throughout December. We have also held a dozen roundtables and webinars for veterans and schools throughout December and January, reaching a combined audience in the thousands. We have begun holding more roundtables with schools, veteran service organizations, state approving agencies, and other stakeholders to keep our partners aware of the developments, solicit suggestions, and help us communicate the upcoming schedule. Each session includes emails afterwards, communicating what was done, and FAQs. Finally, from the beginning of this effort and throughout the successful implementation of the Forever GI Bill, we have and will regularly and transparently update our congressional partners on our progress and our work. This includes holding monthly briefings with the Oversight Committee, submitting the 90-day report as required by public law, and continuing to be responsive to your questions and ask for information. We welcome and encourage the additional opportunities to share information with you and your staff, and we look forward to maintaining this cadence of communication. Thank you. We look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Undersecretary Lawrence. Inspector General Missel, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Chair, Ranking Member Bill Arrakis, Ranking Member Banks, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Office of Inspector General's recent issue statement, Forever GI Bill Implementation Challenges. My statement will focus on the information we collected to respond to concerns from members of Congress and the public about the implementation of the Forever GI Bill requirements. Last fall, VBA acknowledged implementation challenges with Sections 107 and 501 of the Forever GI Bill relating to the housing allowance. These two sections fundamentally redesign how VBA pays monthly housing allowance to veterans using the Post-9/11 Educational Assistance Program. These adjustments included changing the base for the calculation of monthly housing stipends to the location of the campus where the student attends most classes instead of the location of the main campus of the institution. VA's failure to properly implement these requirements led to the delivery of inaccurate or delayed housing stipend payments to eligible GI Bill recipients. The OIG examined VA's early implementation actions and the impediments to meeting Forever GI Bill implementation mandates. The OIG found that VBA's implementation of the payment of the housing allowances under the Forever GI Bill was hampered by the same two underlying issues that have negatively affected VA's implementation of other new policies and initiatives: lack of IT functionality and inadequate program leadership. Specifically, the OIG found that VBA failed to modify its IT systems by the required implementation date to make accurate housing allowance payments. Additionally, VA lacked a single accountable official to oversee the project, which resulted in unclear communications to VA stakeholders of implementation progress and inadequately defined expectations, roles, and responsibilities of the various VA business lines and contractors involved. The OIG found that approximately 10 months passed from the time the Forever GI Bill became law to when VA received the initial software development release and began testing the system modifications to VA's long-term solutions application in order to address Sections 107 and 501. Once VA began testing the software development release, it identified defects that required the development of additional versions of LTS. Based on interviews we conducted, the OIG team learned that when user testing occurred, the tests failed scenarios that VBA did not account for when developing the business requirements. The OIG found that VA's program offices held different expectations from one another as to what they considered complete and accurate business requirements. In addition, VA's Office of Information and Technology and VBA Education Service had divergent opinions of a deployable solution. Without an accountable official, these differing opinions and expectations were not mitigated or resolved and became significant impediments to a successful and timely implementation of the Forever GI Bill requirements. The OIG has continually identified systemic problems that VBA needs to address when implementing new initiatives and policies. These include a lack of IT system functionality, poor planning and communications, and inadequate program leadership. These same systemic problems were significant factors in the delays and disruption VA experienced while attempting to implement the housing allowance requirements in the Forever GI Bill. The OIG will continue to monitor VA's implementation's actions and is reviewing the plan provided to Congress under the Forever GI Bill Housing Payment Fulfillment Act. Mr. Chairman, Madam Chair, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Inspector General Missel. Mr. Schnitzer, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Levin, Chairwoman Lee, ranking members Arrakis and Banks, and distinguished members of the subcommittees. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on matters relating to the implementation of Sections 107 and 501 of the Collocation Act, also known as the Forever GI Bill. MITRE very much appreciates the opportunity to share our insight from our work on this critical program. My name is Jay Schnitzer. I am a Vice President and the Chief Technology Officer with the MITRE Corporation. I would like to make a brief statement and submit my full remarks for the record. MITRE is a 501c3 not-for-profit corporation. We are chartered to operate in the public interest, which includes operating federally funded research and development centers, FFRDCs, on behalf of federal agency sponsors. We currently operate 7 FFRDCs sponsored by a variety of federal agencies. The Department of Veterans Affairs co-sponsors one of these FFRDCs, the MITRE-operated Center for Enterprise Modernization. From our experience, I think it is important to stress to the committee right up front that the kinds of issues VA experienced in implementing the Collocation Act last year are common to agencies attempting to execute highly complex, integrated mission requirements and modernize their systems and processes to address new needs. MITRE's involvement with the Collocation Act began on September 28th of last year when we were engaged by the Office of Information and Technology, OIT, to perform an independent technical assessment, ITA, of VA's implementation efforts. The Collocation Act effort involves the implementation of a major system, the long-term solution, LTS, as well as updates to many other systems involved in administering GI Bill benefits. The focus of the independent assessment was to identify issues related to the delayed delivery of the LTS and to recommend a resolution to the issues associated with completing and deploying the required system updates. The MITRE ITA team identified 4 systemic findings that were preventing rapid integrated capability delivery under the strategy then in place. First, technical and business leaders were not fully empowered to address issues due to a lack of clear authority, priorities, and goals. Second, work priorities, resources, and authorities for execution were not aligned for delivery. 3, operations and processes within and across the Veterans Benefits Administration and OIT were not focused on the Collocation Act functionality. And 4th, data and tools were not integrated across LTS and the legacy systems. To address these findings, these systemic findings, we proposed 20 recommendations, which VA fully accepted. As a result, the following major changes have been implemented. VA appointed the Undersecretary for Benefits, USB, as the overall accountable business leader, aided by the Chief Information Officer. VA chartered and established a new program governance team reporting to the USB with business owner and OIT leadership. VA created a new program integration office accountable to the program governance team and responsible for definition, coordination, and management of functional, technical, and programmatic activities across VA, and VA selected an end-to-end systems integrator to coordinate planning, development, and integrated testing of all systems associated. As is typical for any complex integration effort, the program is not completely without risk, given the many systems and organizational components involved and the many interdependencies. But VA now has in place an integrated program team that is deliberately managing to that risk by identifying the critical path activities and the decisions needed to succeed and the contingencies necessary to mitigate the risk, and they are acting proactively. In closing, I would like to note that of MITRE's roughly 8,500 personnel, some 30% are veterans. There are few duties that our employees consider more noble and consequential than honoring, through our support for VA, the service and sacrifice of our nation's men and women in uniform. On behalf of the entire MITRE team, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to come before you today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schitzer. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes to begin the question portion of this hearing. Dr. Lawrence, you and other officials have testified while VA will not seek reimbursement for veterans who were overpaid because of the implementation issues, you'll retroactively correct underpayments. What are the current efforts to understand how many veterans were underpaid and by how much, and when is VA going to be able to make them whole?
Yes, sir, that's correct. We're in the process of implementing the solution that will go into a place on December 1st. When we've done that, we'll have a better estimate for who exactly we have to make whole and what that number is. Right now, we're developing, and I believe we shared this in the briefings we offered to your staff, the plan to do that. Our intention is to do it as exactly as members have spoken already, as soon as possible. We appreciate the situation veterans are in. We want to do sort of a couple things simultaneously. One, get the system in place and do it right. Two, get the spring going. And three, get everybody reimbursed the way you described. We'll have a plan in detail as this comes about, and we'll brief your staff and you on it when we finalized it. It'll include communication and clarity, so there are no surprises. It'll be intentional, and it'll be the subject of our webinars and our communication with everybody. And we will need to do this because we will need the schools to provide us information. We'll need a lot of things going in the right direction, but we appreciate the situation and want to make sure it's done exactly the way I described.
Thank you, Undersecretary Lawrence. I wanted to reaffirm that while the tone of these hearings sometimes can get contentious, it's our intent to work in a collaborative fashion with the VA and partner in serving our veterans. The lack of clear and forthcoming communication from the VA, though, seems to indicate that the relationship may be somewhat strained. My understanding is it took a lot of cajoling for VA to provide documents related to the new Accenture contract, and although VA did finally provide those, it did so 3 days before this hearing. So I wanted to ask you, sir, how can Congress better partner with the VA to ensure success, and what specific steps will the VA take to be more clear and forthcoming with Congress?
Certainly, and we appreciate that and notice the tone in this conversation too. And you know, to quote somebody famous, we feel your pain because this is the situation we're all in. Most of us are veterans up here. We understand this. And ironically, the person who leads the MITRE team who works with us day to day used the GI Bill, and he's very torn by that. I think the example of providing the contract to you, I looked into this one, is not representative of the communication we're having with you. I'm not an acquisition person or a lawyer, sir, so I don't understand the complexities of that. It frustrated me too when I heard about that because it was our intention. We knew going into the reset we would have to be the most transparent we've ever been, and then some, to give you re-win your level of confidence with us. And so the briefings, the communication, that's our intention. Again, I think that was an exception, and to the extent I wish I were responsible, I would apologize for it, but I don't quite understand where that is. But we'll try to do everything we can so you know about it and answer your questions so that you feel informed.
Thank you for that. You may be aware we had the Principal Deputy Undersecretary testify before the subcommittee, Ms. Devlin, and she said with 100% certainty, so we actually asked her on a scale, I think we asked her on a scale of 1 to 10, she said 10 out of 10, certainty that this issue was going to be resolved, that the IT-related issues, the correct payment of benefits, the correct zip codes for our veterans, et cetera, that would all be fixed by the end of the year. Again, she said 10 out of 10. Do you share that opinion?
Absolutely.
That's good. 10 out of 10?
10 out of 10.
All right. Wanted to turn to the Accenture contract. VA has spoken of the requirement that Accenture produce a fully operational system in some terms that makes it seem like all the risk is on Accenture. From a contractual standpoint, it may be, but ensuring that student veterans receive the benefits they deserve require the VA also be completely invested in the development, testing, evaluation, and operation of the system. Dr. Lawrence, how are you ensuring that this contract goes well? And what, if anything, are you doing differently than the previous contract?
Certainly. Well, several different things, but let me answer your first part of your question first, which is the monitoring of the contract. So we work closely with our acquisition folks who run the acquisition and to include monitoring the contract. So they are very kept abreast of the activities they are required to do. The contract was actually led by our colleagues in OIT, the integration of this team together. They watch and do regular reviews, as well as we do regular reviews as a broad team in terms of the activity, the schedule, the scope, and the like. We have not forgotten the lessons from the fall where, perhaps our inability to aggressively monitor the contract came back and caused us problems. So we certainly don't want that to happen again. More broadly, though, to your question about what's different, and I know this came up in a couple of the statements already, I would point to three things that are different than the past. One was, as everyone's pointed out, the lack of an accountable official. So now we have a single accountable official, a role I asked the Secretary to appoint. But there's two other things that are less subtle that I want to draw your attention to. The first one, related to the first point, was the accountable official enables crisp governance, timely decisions, resolution of conflict, realignment of things that are unaligned. The second one was hiring MITRE to be the program integrator. This is, if you will, a super program manager to keep everybody on track and dispute decisions where technical experts are perhaps in conflict. MITRE's expertise as an FFRDC enables them to bring vast knowledge of how other government programs work, as well as technical expertise to this role. This is a big difference. And finally, hiring a world-class systems integrator and software development firm. What we learned last time was it was a systems integration discussion. The last statement by Congressman Banks about the different systems is exactly what we're talking about, which is why a systems integrator was needed. So those three things give us a level of confidence that we better understand the problem and our approach to it is on track.
Thank you. I have plenty more questions, but so do my colleagues. I want to be respectful of them as well. So I'd now like to recognize my friend, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Arrakis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Dr. Lawrence, one of the most common complaints we have received last fall was that the VA was not appropriately communicating with the schools and students regarding payment delays. We also received complaints from schools over the lack of communication on how to expedite hardship claims for student veterans who relied heavily on these payments to survive. What lessons have you learned about communicating? And tell, you can give me your opinion on what I just said too, but what lessons have you learned about communicating with students, and how do you plan to remain in touch with veterans whose monthly housing allowance will drop when payments are corrected to follow the law on January 1st, 2020?
Certainly. A lot of lessons, quite frankly. The pain you experienced was the pain we felt, too, of people communicating with us and explaining the financial hardship situations they were in. We took a lot of steps to communicate the numbers to call. We had regular phone calls with the VSOs, but in many cases it fell short, as you pointed out. We intend to do more of that. Just so you know, part of what I did last fall was held a student roundtable, Texas A&M, talk to students directly. I will go to Pittsburgh and do the same thing at a community college in a couple weeks to better understand that. But we intend to do more. We intend it to be redundant and a lot. But not only with the students, with the schools, we understand their situation and we know what we're going to do come December and beyond is going to put requirements on them for them to provide us information all the way back to August of last year. So we know we're going to have to communicate. We've enlisted the VSOs, we've enlisted everybody to try to let them understand where this will be and how it will play out for them, how they can communicate situations that may cause difficulties in their life and what we can do to expedite it. We want to make sure that as we redo the reset, everybody understands their role and they should have none of these problems. Now, that being said, yes, will somebody not get the memo, not get the email? I can't guarantee it. Probably enlist the help of you or your staff. I know people have been good about communicating to us through that, about looking on this and do some of these things. So we'll try as hard as we can possibly imagine to use the multiple forms of media, the multiple channels available to us to let everybody know the situations they're in and what they need to do.
And then you need to communicate with members of Congress as well, so we can get the word out.
Oh, yes,
Very
please.
important for.
Yes, thank you. We'll do a lot of that.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Lawrence, again, in the contract documents recently provided in the committee, to the committee, Booz Allen Hamilton submitted a response to VA's request for information associated with IT reset. In this response, they indicated they could complete the IT modifications for sections 107 and 501 by July 1st, 2019. They also indicated that VA's changes regarding school zip codes would, and I quote, not have the intended impact of simplifying the implementation, and that they believe those rules had already been coded into LTS. What is your view of Booz Allen Hamilton's assertions?
I'm unfamiliar with the document you're referring to and very much appreciate a chance to look at it in some detail, to deal with it in detail. But I will tell you, it was a thoughtful analysis that went into the decision to reset and the approach forward. We had concluded that we needed, as I said a second ago, a systems integrator to solve the problem of all the different things, and the software development as just witnessed by what we talked about. I repeatedly appeared before the committee and in members' offices explaining we did not understand what date we'd ever be able to complete the software. Repeatedly, we came up short. The contractor was unable to identify how we would ever get this resolved, and I was quite frankly embarrassed to sit in front of you in November of this committee of last year and not be able to provide a date when it would be done. We were approaching the problem in the wrong way, and we needed a reset, which is what we did, and we needed better expertise to help us, different expertise to help us with the MITRE Corporation and with the world-class systems integrator.
All right, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll go back to the balance of my time.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize Chairwoman Lee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As the Chair of Technology Modernization, I'm looking at the implementation of IT systems across the VA, most notably the largest implementation, the electronic health record modernization. As I said in my opening, lack of governance is a common problem, and I see stovepiping happening where OIT has a piece and the VHA has a piece, yet the program office is supposed to be the middleman between the two. But this isn't solving the problems long-standing at the VA, like the technical debt, the outdated infrastructure, or change management among clinicians. There's also stovepiping in the case of the Forever GI implementation, where both IT and VBA had a role, but no one seemed to be in charge. Mr. Jaffer, have the problems with implementation of the Forever GI bill caused the VA to reevaluate its approach to system implementation?
Chairwoman, I'll speak for myself and say that those experiences absolutely have informed the process. As we look at the lessons learned around Colmurray, I can tell you I was just talking with my head of development and operations today and with Rob Arifsi, our program manager, and he said we are absolutely pulling those lessons learned from how this team is working together across VBA, with the systems integrator, with MITRE, and with the vendor, with Accenture. And there are a lot of good lessons learned and shared. And going forward, we look to port those across to the other programs you reference.
That's good to hear. Thank you. MITRE has made some recommendations regarding how program management should be structured, and I want to understand those recommendations a little bit better and how the VA is responding to them. Dr. Schnitzer, You recommended that the VA establish this Cole-Marie Act champion to serve as a chartered and empowered business leader across the VBA and OIT. What type of leader should fill this role?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chairwoman. I think the type of leader is somebody who accepts that responsibility and has the authority within the organization to work across all of the different components and be effective. The Undersecretary is a perfect example of such an individual.
Thank you. Dr. Lawrence, you've designated a champion?
I'm that person, ma'am.
You are?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, okay. Do you believe, Dr. Schnitzer, you also recommended creating an end-to-end chief system integrator. What's the value of that role?
So the integration part of the project addresses the problems that have been stated previously, which is working on one piece of software in isolation without understanding all the connections to it, both inputs and outputs and the mutual dependencies, won't solve the problem. So having the contractor now as a systems integrator who is looking at all of that in a cross-functional way is essential for success. And that is a key difference for the program today as opposed to prior to the reset.
Thank you. You also have a recommendation to create a lightweight governance council. I'm a little, just like some clarification about lightweight, and also can you explain how it should operate?
So lightweight just refers to the minimum number of people on it that are necessary to get the job done, so that it's not overly bureaucratic and so that scheduling meetings doesn't get overly complicated because you're trying to bring in too many people into each meeting. And then the effectiveness is measured on how fast can issues that arise, as Dr. Lawrence mentioned, how fast can they be adjudicated and move on. And I would say that from our perspective, what we've seen in the last few months is issues that previously could take weeks or even months are now being adjudicated and dealt with effectively in days and sometimes hours. And that's exactly the outcome desired.
Great, thank you. And I yield my time. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Muser for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to all of you. Nice to see all of you again. And certainly thank you for your service. I do have some experiences in implementation of informational technology systems as well as with Accenture. I served as Revenue Secretary for the Pennsylvania Department of Revenue, and we had a over $100 million contract with Accenture. So I have some experiences there, and I want to ask you about that contract some. Is the contract based upon Accenture gets paid for the work accomplished, for the work that's performed? Dr. Lawrence?
So by that, are you asking, is it a time and materials contract?
Yeah, for accomplishing certain goals and implementation of and the integration that takes place, do they then get paid upon it being completed?
It is a fixed price contract, so let's establish that part.
Okay.
And I'm not exactly certain, again, I'm not versed in the details of how they get paid.
Right.
So I'm not, do you know, Rob?
It is a firm fixed price contract, and it is outcome based, so they will be paid based off their performance to meet the goals set forward to establish functionality to implement Cole-Marie Section 107 and 501 for the base year.
Okay, great. And have they set such timelines for you?
We set up the initial timelines in terms of our goals in reaching December 1st, 2019. They have provided plans and they have provided their agile increments in order to arrive at the dates and give us adequate time to have the solution in place.
How have they done so far?
They have been doing very well so far, and they have brought the correct people to bear to provide us with the solution needed.
And that was my next question. The best thing that they provide is their human resources. And they can give you ample amount, they can give you a higher amount so as we are assured we hit the deadlines, or they can lag behind, which causes delays. Where would you say you are as far as their human resources allocation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. In terms of their resources allocation, they have quickly brought, I would say, very senior people to bear on this effort. From day one, as soon as the contract was signed, they had resources on board and were meeting with us to arrive towards the plan for getting us to the solution. And they have surged very quickly, and we've been onboarding very fast in terms of having the right people to bear. They've also brought people with former knowledge of the solution into play, and so we are looking very good in terms of their human resource allocation.
Sir, and if I might add, I meet weekly with the managing director from Accenture who worries about this contract and the broad VA portfolio. I have access to the chief operating officer of their federal practice who gave me his card and phone number. I can call whenever those things are not, but I'm attuned to your concerns on that.
Great, yes. I did have a very successful relationship with them. I will also add, though, the proverbial squeaky wheel gets the grease. And I would also suggest don't hesitate to go to the top. I mean, this is obviously a high priority for them and a high priority for our government, our country.
Congressman, I can assure you, Dr. Lawrence and I both were on the commercial side. We know those levers to press, but reassure you on that.
All right, very good. And in my remaining time, Dr. Lawrence, Secretary Lawrence, the MITRE findings here, you mentioned about the accountability, so that's terrific. And these are not atypical findings, I wouldn't say. And they're also curable. Secondly, where he mentioned the respective pieces were working independently, not working together. Would you say that's something that you feel confident in bringing together?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, part of the conversation setting up the PIO was having an integrated team, standalone entity in our organization, enlisting the resources from OIT who are dedicated to working on this, not drawn in different directions, focused on this. We have 21 FTEs from OIT who work with us on this. It's clear focus about what they're doing. Other assignments have been reduced or eliminated. And this is what we're working on. From VBA, from the benefits, we have 10 people. This is their full-time job. This is what we do. So there's very clear focus. It's an integrated team. Spending a lot of time working together. We're in the VBA headquarter building. This is what they're doing.
Yes, all involved need to feel ownership, equal ownership, absolutely. Well, that's very good to hear. And Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Muser. Now recognize Mr. Pappas. He's stepping out. It's your turn. Terrific. Thank you, Mr. Pappas. I'll now recognize Ranking Member Banks for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Schnitzel, I'm very concerned about the VA's inability to test the software code that its contractors produce against all of the relevant VA IT systems. Of MITRE's 20 recommendations, the very last one that VA expects to implement is establishing common development and testing environments. Do you agree with that under ideal conditions that this would be one of the first steps completed?
So under ideal conditions, it could be one of the first steps completed. On the other hand, we live in the real world where some things depend on sequences and you can't change that, and this is one of those. So there's no practical or physical way to change the sequence presented before us today. So it has to be number 20. Right. So, and we have to do the best we can with that. However, it can be mitigated. So you're absolutely right. The integrated test doesn't occur until the very end, but individual tests along the way in other environments are occurring all the time, and that reduces the risk of the final test. So the final.
Mr. Missel, do you agree with that?
Agree with which?
And how important is that? How do you agree with what the gentleman just said? And how important is that testing? I believe they call it regression testing.
Do I agree that
I'm asking Mr. Missel.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We agree that the testing MITRE did is very, very important. We did not get into the technical side of this, given that MITRE had already done that. But we've seen similar issues with the testing in other systems that we looked in other reports that we've done, including one on VBMS and some other systems.
Okay.
Congressman, if I might, one of the other challenges
I've got a lot of ground to cover.
Gotcha.
At some point I'll get to you, I promise. But Dr. Schnitzer, MITRE performed a review of Booz Allen Hamilton's software code and found it to be generally high quality. Is that an accurate characterization?
Yes, it is.
Okay. In our last Forever GI Bill hearing in November, the Booz Allen Hamilton witness insisted his company had delivered good software code based on VA's requirements. VA announced its intention to replace Booz Allen less than a month later. Given the fact that VA still does not have pre-production testing environments, can anyone say for sure whether Booz Allen's code would have worked, Doctor?
We have fairly good evidence that it would not have because of the lack of integration. So even though it was good code in the functional environment, it would not have succeeded, and we're very confident of that.
Have you shared that evidence with the committee?
We've shared it with VA.
But not with the committee. If we requested you would share that with us as well.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Giffer, Accenture is supposed to determine what of Booz Allen's software code it should reuse. How will they accomplish that and when?
Congressman, they have access to the code, as you've kind of established already. As was mentioned previously, the contract vehicle is on firm fixed price, and so there is every incentive to use existing code where it would be supported. So that code is the property of the government. Accenture has access to it. As they find that there is value in it, they may use it. One of the challenges around that, though, is the user requirements and, eliciting the right user requirements, which I believe that in MITRE's ITA they found is one of the problem areas. And so it's really hard to reuse substantial amounts of code when they may have been coded for different user requirements.
Okay. Undersecretary Lawrence, I believe VA learned lessons from last year, and I think you now fully understand the task in front of you. But the situation is not any more favorable. In fact, it seems almost exactly the same. And you have less time than what you had before. Would you agree that if VA is able to implement MITRE's 10 remaining recommendations by the deadlines that you set, that would give you just enough time to test Accenture's code, correct any problems, and implement the remainder of the law with minimal schedule cushion?
Generally, but I'd push back on your word just, sir. I think the answer you've gotten before about how we're going to test en route is not just, but I think your point is a good one. The timeline is short, and we need to make sure that when we go into operation, it is tested and ready to go.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back and reserve my following questions for the second round.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Now I'd like to recognize Ms. Luria for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for taking the time to update us on this today. I want to follow up on Chairman Levin's question, because I'm a little bit confused after that question. I recall that in November, Secretary Wilkie said that, quote, once the VA is in a position to process education claims in accordance with the new law, each and every beneficiary will receive retroactively the exact benefits to which they are entitled under that law. So you've echoed that they'll be getting appropriate benefits. If they were overpaid, you won't be recouping the amount. But what I gathered from Chairman Levin's question and your response is that there's not really a system that you're tracking. Do you fully understand the scope of it? Do you have a system to track the differential between what the students received and what they should have received and the amount they're entitled to receive under the GI Bill? Do you know the total price tag of that, how many students it is, and who they are?
Thank you. So that's a two-part question. So first, there's Section 501 of the law, which is dealing with the DoD rates, the cap rates. Once we flip the switch on December 1st, we'll be able to know automatically how many students are impacted from an overpayment standpoint. But for the second part of that, for the Section 107 piece, as it relates to the monthly housing allowance of where the student spends the majority of their time, that will be dependent on the schools resubmitting enrollment documents. It won't be until all schools have recertified students back to August 1st of 2018 that we will really know or realize the overpayments and underpayment situations associated with that. Right now, we have asked schools to track students from August 1st of 2018 to tell us exactly who may be in the position of not attending the majority of their classes at the main location. And when it comes time, we'll allow them to recertify those students after December 1st. But the first phase—
It's really December 1st is when you need the schools to give you data. So December 1st is not when our constituents can expect to actually have this fixed if they go online.
So what will happen on December 1st when we flip the switch? Two things will happen. The first piece will be the DoD rates will kick in. That'll be the first piece. all spring 2020 terms will be made whole from that perspective. So any term that comes, or any enrollment that comes in for spring 2020 will be processed in accordance with the Section 107 and 501 rules. The piece that we still need to work on in coordination with schools will be the piece of going back to correct records from August 1st of 2018 to up to December 1st of 2019.
Okay, so just to summarize all of that, you don't actually know the scope of the problem yet.
We have a sense of the scope of the problem. We're actually working with schools right now. I will say that we are actually working with the top 10 largest GI Bill beneficiary schools to figure out exactly how many records will they have to go back and correct come December 1st.
Okay, thank
So
you.
we're building the plan right now.
Okay, I don't want to repeat myself a third time, but you really don't have any idea of how many students this has affected at this point in time after the numerous discussions we've had on this, but you're fully confident that by December 1st that you're going to have a fix?
Yeah, I think you uncharitably describe our situation in your first part of your question. We understand the number of students, we understand where they were enrolled, we understand what the consequences of. We just can't give you an exact number yet because we have to do the math and have the system set up. We know exactly what's going to happen when that happens, and Charmaine tried to explain that. We will do the recomputations, we will go back and adjudicate and communicate as soon as we can. That's our intention to do that. We don't have the precise number right now because the different variables will have to be nailed down.
And so will that require interaction by a person, by a staff member of the VA with each student individually? And if so, do you have adequate staff to address that?
So there's multiple parts. One, we'll have to have interaction with the schools in order to recertify. Also, we'll need to work with students to make sure they're educated about exactly what their benefits will look like come spring 2020. So we know the schools are the front line, so we're actually working with schools on a communications toolkit, so that way they can be able to educate students about the exact calculations of what they should expect to receive when spring 2020 rolls around.
Okay, thank you. I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Luria. I now recognize Mr. Watkins for 5 minutes.
Thank you. The President's budget for fiscal year 2020 anticipates a drop in the number of direct employees processing education claims. But you're expecting, the budget also predicts an increase in the number of calls and claims. So how will this $6.1 million decrease in the education services account affect VA's ability to assure timely response and payment to veterans?
So there's no impact in terms of processing claims right now when it comes to our President's budget. I will say what we are looking at right now is the impacts of going back to correct all records for Section 107 in particular, and the workload associated with that. And we're working with leadership in terms of what additional resources, if any, will be needed when it comes time to go back and correct records.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Lamb for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Undersecretary Lawrence or Ms. Bogg, whoever wants to answer this, I just want to confirm, I think this is clear, but if someone in my state of Pennsylvania is enrolled in Penn State, and let's just assume for the purpose of this question that the main campus at State College probably has higher allowances than Penn State Beaver, which is a satellite campus in my district. If they've been going to Penn State Beaver but getting the State College rate in 2018 and 2019 before December 1st, are they going to be hit up for an overpayment when December 1st happens?
No, they will not. Anyone who, once we roll out the system, any overpayments will be written off by VA because it's not the fault of the student.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure of that. Do they know that? Has that been communicated to?
So we have direct communication in terms of, we've done an email campaign to students to let them know that when the time comes for December 1st, they will not be responsible for any overpayments associated with Sections 107 and 501. And also when we flip the switch on December 1st and we start sending out letters to students about their new payments, we will have information in that particular letter that will state that they are not responsible for the overpayment as well.
Thank you. That's very useful. I think one of the things that at least we heard the most about in my office when this happened last year was, I mean, people were frustrated by the glitch, but they were even more frustrated, I think, by the lack of communication. Can you spell out for us maybe a little bit more concrete steps you've taken to address that part of it? Because this, unfortunately, dealing with technology as it is, probably won't be the last time this happens in some way. So how has the VA addressed the ability to communicate in these unexpected situations?
Right. So thank you for that question. So I will state we've done several things since the past fall. And one thing is we've done direct, like I said, email campaigns to students, but also we've set up veteran webinars for students as well, so that way they can join and we can talk about what's coming down the pike. And we will continue that dialogue. Also, we understand schools are the front line, so we're trying to make sure that schools have the necessary information to educate students earlier in the process versus waiting until after December 1st for students to figure out what's going to happen in the spring. So we're trying different modes in terms of communication with students, between email campaign, between the letters that we send out, as well as the veteran webinars, as well as social media, to educate students about the changes that are coming down the pike. The other piece I would add is that we have the GI Bill comparison tool. That tool is a very useful tool. It actually displays schools, VA-approved schools on that tool, and actually has a GI Bill calculator on that tool. Students can actually enter in the location, the actual location, zip code location of the campus that they're attending, and they will actually see the rate that they will receive in spring of 2020 now.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And I know, Dr. Lawrence, you mentioned you're doing some traveling to try to get the word out, too. I'm thrilled to hear you're coming to Pittsburgh, so please let our office know if we can be of assistance in attracting folks there. I also just wanted to remind you that at our last hearing together, we had talked a little bit about training for claims adjudicators on the appeals modernization, and my office sent you a letter on April 12th, so just coming up on a month ago, with some pretty specific questions about the AMA implementation training and how it affected our claims adjudicators back home. So just wanted to remind you of that. We will be expecting a response when you can provide one.
No, I appreciated that. And just so you know, I went back and talked to the RO leader in Pittsburgh about your exchange we had and the information around the training. So I'll look in onto the letter too. So yes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamb. And I recognize Mr. Bergman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of you for being here. We know that what you deal with is not just simple math or easy. There's a lot of everything from changing technology to bureaucratic tools that are in place that may or may not be as efficient as we would like them to be when we're making our decisions. Dr. Lawrence or Mr. Jiffer, I have a question about the Accenture contract documents that VA provided to the committee. 4 companies provided, they submitted proposals. Accenture's proposal was initially rated, quote, susceptible to being made acceptable. VA allowed all 4 companies to revise their proposals to correct any weaknesses and shortcomings in those proposals, and each of the companies did. In the second round evaluation, Accenture's rating went up to, quote, outstanding, while no other company's rating changed. VA awarded the contract to Accenture despite it proposing the highest price, which was a jump up from the original pricing. In fact, 2 of the companies pretty much stayed at the same price, and one of the other companies bumped up a little bit, but Accenture had the largest increase. But anyway, Accenture, despite it proposing the highest priced and having the worst past performance rating, was awarded the contract. Care to offer any explanation as to exactly what happened there, with Accenture being the only one to make the big jump when I'm guessing all 4 of the companies had the opportunity to upgrade their proposals?
Certainly. Mr. Jaffer and I served as technical advisors to the evaluation process. We were in no decision-making role, merely to be informed. We had 2 interactions with the acquisition decision authority, if you will, the group who were running the process you just described. The first interaction was when they shared with us the scores for 4 companies, 4 entities. These were blacked out. We knew them as A, B, C, D. And they revealed the scoring, which, as you indicated, that some were at a certain level, some were at a certain level. Their recommendation to us was that we engage in a round of question and answers with everybody to provide them a chance to fix the proposal shortcomings they had. It was a recommendation to us. They said, this is what we would normally do, and do you have any questions? It was not a decision for us to make. It was simply a recommendation of what they were going to do in the next step, and they informed us. They said it will take some more time, but this is what we would normally do in an acquisition of this thing. So we said, sure, we don't have a decision. We understand. We appreciate you telling us what it'll do for the timeline we're under. We do that. What is likely to happen, we asked. Some will improve, some will not, some will change their price. Exactly what you described happened.
Uniquely, and I don't know what the relative norm here is, but let's say in this case, okay, there could be an increase in price, but over 10%, what kind of things change in that upgraded proposal, again, that made them stand out as outstanding?
Sure.
And it's just interesting.
So understand your question. Neither Mr. Jaffer or I will be able to answer that. We were not privy to the information. We were privy to the scores at the end. I can't recall.
So should we either convene a hearing for the folks who made the decision, or how do we find out? Again, my Marine Corps background, military background as a commander tends to, I look into the decision-making process to make sure.
Sure.
Make sure that we are using criteria across the board that does not either accidentally or on purpose play any type of what could be potentially construed as favoritism.
No, I don't think that existed in this process. What the criteria was, and it was stated in the request for information as well as the request for proposal, it heavily weighted the technical solution. So at the end of the question and answer period, the total compilation of the score of the winner, in this case Accenture, was greater than the scores of the other. I forget the details exactly, but perhaps this is in the documents you have. Their technical part of their score had increased so much more that it offset, I believe, their lower past performance score that you made reference to. The net of it was, using the criteria the acquisition people ran, their score was greater than the others, hence the award.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bergman. I'd now like to recognize the ranking member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, Dr. Rowe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank the panel for being here, and Dr. Lawrence, thank you for the work on the board. I think the appeals modernization is going pretty well from what I hear, and the way I can figure that out is if I don't hear anything, that's probably a good thing. So last August, I was up in Springfield, Illinois with Congressman Davis, and we're rolling out the GI Bill, and we had a group of educators around, and at that point in time, we thought that it was going to be able to roll out and all the glitches at the, as we know the history of that, and it obviously didn't. And I met with the VBA team and the OIT team along with you in my office on the 13th of September of last year, and where you thought the system would be ready to go in a matter of weeks, and that was your conclusion at that point. I guess your team had told you that in a few weeks you thought that would be, you were up and running. But that's correct, I think, and that.
I think at that time you were frustrated with me because I said I didn't know, but I might know in a few weeks.
Okay, well, that's what, anyway, that's what, so we're on the same page there. The VA Commission MITRE to do the independent technical assessment on the 28th of September, and I know did you think that you had a serious problem when you met with me or not, and did something happen in between that 2 weeks that made you realize that?
I think part of what we experienced was a sense of not knowing the scope of the problem, and hence the desire to have MITRE bring expertise to better understand it. I know what is always frustrating is sit in front of folks doing oversight, wanting to know exactly what's going to, and not know. The getting MITRE involved was to better appreciate the situation so that we could describe to you some facts rather than some unknowns and senses.
I think, and at the end of the day, and we're in obviously an important year because we understand that the target date full implementation is 1 December of this year. That's only 7 months away. And what will be a good milestone to indicate that are going to meet that deadline? Because I think there are a lot of people, when young men and women enroll in college for the fall semester, obviously they're still enrolling in the old system. So when they start the spring of 2020, can we say with some assurity now, we're not that far away?
So we actually have two releases. So we have Build 1, and we're working towards Build 1 right now for the solution that's supposed to be put in place for December. Testing for that first build will be completed in the June timeframe. Then there'll be a second build. After the second build, we'll test a little bit and finish testing in October timeframe, and then we'll have a good sense early October whether that is ready for prime time for December 1st. We wanted to make sure we built in enough cushion so that way, one, we can start really pushing out communications to students after the 1st of October, and then two, so that way we can train schools on the new process for certification.
So, so next month, there's one build out that'll be done, and then in October, there'll be a build. Mr. Chairman, if we could, I would love to have the subcommittee follow up on that, because we certainly don't want a January 15th, when most of the young folks go back to school, hiccup, and it's not working. We need, if we could have another hearing or something, I would really appreciate it. And Dr. Lawrence, can you provide us an update on the VTAC and Tech program?
So thank you for that question. So we're happy to report that early February, we actually went live with our VetTech website as well as our training provider application. Since that time, we've had over 30 training providers come in and apply for that program. We've approved 4 programs to date, and the other 4, we've denied another 4 programs. The reason for those denials are usually because they don't meet the 2-year requirement to have a program existence for 2 years. The other piece of that, the other applications that are remaining applications, they're in the works. They've submitted an application, but it was a completed application, so we're trying to work with those training providers to finalize that other piece. Then a couple of weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, we actually did a soft launch of the veteran application. From that soft launch, we had 300 veterans apply. We worked out some kinks on the application. We did a live launch actually last week on the veteran application, and since going with the live launch last week, we actually had over 1,100 veterans apply for that program. So that's where we are right now with VetTech.
So it's moving pretty rapidly then.
It's moved pretty rapidly, yes.
1,100 applications for how many slots?
So we don't know exact slots. We know the dollars that are allocated per year, and based off the dollars allocated per year, we're estimating, based off of the cost of some of these programs, somewhere between 800 to 1,100 veterans could potentially participate in this program per year.
So literally, we've already had, I'll yield back and say, actually had more people apply than we have money to provide for the slots, is that right?
Potentially.
Okay.
Potentially. One thing we noticed that some of those folks that actually applied for the program, their particular program that they applied for is not approved, so we're reaching out back to those training providers to state, hey, this veteran's actually interested in participating in your program under VetTech, so we would love for you guys to come in and be a training provider under the VetTech program and to help them through that application process.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Rowe, and we'll be happy to discuss and accommodate that request. I think it's a good idea to do another hearing, and we can have our committee staff work with your staff to make that happen. We do have time for a few more questions, if that's all right with our witnesses. I know a few of us have more questions. Undersecretary, and I'd like to recognize myself first for 5 minutes. Undersecretary Lawrence, I wanted to go back to your answer to Ms. Luria, where I think if I heard right, you said that you knew how many veterans were impacted by some of the IT issues, but you wouldn't specify how many. You wouldn't give us a number. I was wondering if you could help us square those two statements.
Sure. I think what I took away from the intent of her question was a sense of us not knowing exactly. So what I tried to clarify was we do know the universe of veterans. We do know what happened. We do know what we intend to do. The precision around it, we still have to work out, as Charmaine was trying to explain. First, we roll into effect December 1st, then we get the schools to do the information. So I just want to make sure we were communicating exactly what we were doing, because I want to leave the impression that we have a plan to have a plan. We intend to brief you on it. We intend to describe it, and we intend to communicate with the students so they understand exactly how it's going to be, you know, paid to them or written off. So that's, I just want to make sure we are clear
But you don't know how many specifically. You know the overall universe, obviously.
That's
but
right.
You don't know how many specifically were underpaid.
That's correct. That's where when we have the things on December 1st going, then we'll know.
Okay. Regarding the Accenture contract, what specific milestones have you set for them, and how are you going to assess whether those milestones are met?
So thank you for that question. Our initial milestones, as Charmaine stated earlier, we have broken their deliverable into 2 separate builds. The first one, which we're starting testing in June. And so we will be doing testing around that, and we will evaluate that based off the testing results from that release. The second part of that build is slated for October 1st, or the first week in October, and we're looking at starting testing in September. And we will then evaluate those test results against the requirements of the contract, and then we will work with them to determine whether they've completely and fulfilled those requirements.
Thank you for that. Mr. Missel and Dr. Schnitzer, wanted to turn to you. As you both know, the Forever GI Bill became public law August 2017, directed VA to implement the provisions by August 2018. VA was aware of the bill and its provisions prior to its passage, had nearly a full year after passage to provide updates, request clarifications, extensions, and ultimately implement the provisions. Few of those things happened, however, and those that did were long after the VA repeatedly missed deadlines, as had been promised. Mr. Missel and Dr. Schnitzer, to both of you, in the future, what should be some appropriate milestones for VA to check in with Congress and report progress on their projects so that this doesn't happen again?
I don't think there can be enough communications to make sure that expectations are met. In our issue statement, what we did is we put together a chronology of events. And one of the things that we identified, there didn't seem to be the sense of urgency to get the project off the ground. It took many months before they really got to the point where they're doing the kind of work that you would expect early on. And I think what we've seen in other situations, the communication and the expectation of when they can get something done is sometimes not realistic. And I think in all these situations, lessons should be learned, and hopefully going forward it'll be better.
Any follow-up on that?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. I would agree with that, but I would add also that I think it's important to pay attention to the critical path of one of these complicated projects and identify all the items that are in the critical path to success, know what that is up front, have that broadly communicated, have the right governance, and then have a systems integrated approach to it rather than silos.
And my last question for the Inspector General, during the opening statements, there were a couple comments that sort of downplayed this, made it sound like, well, you know, these are big things to implement, these things happen, kind of a normal course, ordinary course. Do you agree with those characterizations?
We agree that anytime they're doing a system implementation, particularly on something as significant as this, they need to make sure that they're properly planning, they have the resources, they have the expertise, significantly that they communicate, because one of the concerns we have is when you bring in a number of different organizations involved that may not have worked together well, you're going to naturally have communication issues. You have to make sure everybody's on the same page. What we found here is that they were essentially talking different languages because you had OINT, you had VBA, you had a contractor, and they weren't all on the same page. So in all of the system integration they're doing, and VA has a number of significant systems that they're involved in, you need to have all of those going forward.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'd now like to recognize Mr. Banks for another 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Schnitzer, your independent technical assessment highlighted the inherent difficulties of VA's IT system environment, the constant changing requirements, and lack of organization. In your opinion, could any contractor have succeeded in implementing Sections 107 and 501 last year?
So the short answer is I don't know. I mean, and I have no way of knowing because we weren't involved at that point and don't have all the evidence from that period of time. But I will say that in general, if the requirements are understood to be merely writing code and not doing a systems integration approach to a problem like this, then nobody will succeed. And that's the shared lesson that I think we need to bring forward, not just for this program, but for all existing and future programs at VA.
Mr. Missel, do you have any follow-on advice on that?
I think, again, it goes back to trying to be realistic about when you think you can really deliver something. And that, again, dealing with it with a sense of urgency right up front, making sure you have the right expertise. And if there are doubts, making sure those doubts are expressed so that you don't have a situation where there's a surprise at the end.
Okay. Mr. Jiffer, did the U.S. Digital Service or VA Digital Service conduct any analysis of the Forever GI Bill implementation? And if so, when did this happen, and was there a report submitted?
Congressman, I'm not aware of any digital service interaction to the type that you specify. I would have to, given that it was likely if it occurred, it was before my arrival 4 months ago, I would have to defer to my business partners if they have any knowledge of that.
I don't know of any.
No, we don't. There was not one done by digital service.
Great. That's all I have. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I now recognize Chairwoman Lee for 5 minutes.
Dr. Lawrence, I'd like to ask you just a few questions about the Accenture contract. First of all, under the contract, Accenture is required to provide bi-weekly reports to the VA. Can this committee receive those reports?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Can we receive any already produced as well as into the future?
Yes.
Thank you. Secondly, the contract language states that the base period of the contract is February 2019 to February 2020, and there's a one-year option from February 2020 to February 21. However, the contract also states that the ultimate completion date is May 14th, 2021. How do these dates track with the VA statement that the system's going to be operational? And then what activities are contemplated during those optional periods?
Sure. The systems will be operational refers to December 1st of 2019, so that's the first year covered by this. The 2-year contract had sort of the following vision. First year, get Comary 107-501 going. Second year, modernize some of the systems problems you've heard described. Theoretically, the vision was you now be familiar with what's going on, some of the piece parts, and that we could have a different approach, much more of a world-class financial institution, and that's what would take place in the second year.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Jaffer, I'm just sort of coming at this looking at, first of all, I can tell by the men and women you have here and knowing there's many men and women in the VA who are working very hard trying to make sure we're delivering these benefits to our veterans. And I thank them all for their service. I feel like we get caught in this hamster wheel. We have well-intended congresspeople like ourselves who pass legislation asking for benefits for our veterans. We, require the VA to implement it, resulting in legacy systems, one placed on top of the other. So while you're trying to still implement a legacy system from before, we layer in something on top of you. So certainly I can understand the problems that we encounter. One question I have is, does OIT have an inventory of all the legacy systems?
Yes, Congresswoman, we do.
Will you be able to provide us with a list of them, their function, and who in the VA is responsible for them?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, and I yield my time.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lee. I now recognize our ranking member, Dr. Rowe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of very quick questions. We know the target date's 1 December of this year, and maybe you answered the question, but what would be a good milestone so that we know that you're going to make that deadline? Is that the October stand-up, or when is that when we're really going to know, just a month before?
The October deadline was when we will know if we're ready for deployment for December 1st.
And if we're not ready, then what happens in January of 2020?
So if we're not ready, well, first we'll be communicating with you directly. As you know, we brief your team monthly on what's going on, and we're very sensitive to this issue, so certainly there would be no surprise. If we're not ready, we're going to have a plan to be ready, but at a minimum, students will be continued to be paid under the rates we're using now, so we don't have the problem we had in the fall of 18. So everyone will be continued to be paid, we'll get the system ready, and then we will go back.
So, and it's still, the hold harmless still
Absolutely.
will be there. Okay, one other quick question, and then I'll be done. And this is for Dr. Lawrence, if I can find it here. Here we go. Outside of the IT modifications, what do you see as the biggest challenge that could impact full implementation by 1 December?
This is probably unfair, because I don't mean it to sound like our interactions with the schools and the veterans is very, very important. So we depend upon the schools to get us information. So we don't want veterans calling up and saying, I haven't been paid, and come to find out the schools didn't send us the right thing. That would be unfortunate. So we're trying real hard to make sure all the people who are involved in the process of getting students enrolled and paid are dealt with, and we're communicating. Right? That's our issue, to communicate, teach, train, and inform, but that's what we worry about, that doesn't happen at the end. All the things we'll have done successfully and right won't have happened, and nobody will know that unless they get paid.
You know, I know the veteran wants, they've got a payment at the end of the month, they've got a light bill or you know, their rent's due or whatever. So they're very much need that money. Did the colleges get paid on time? They have a little more cushion, obviously, to take the student, whereas it's more acute for the student who has a bill at the end of the month. So are they pushing you, the colleges pushing you to get their money? Are they not getting it on time? Are they getting it on time? I don't know.
So there's no impact to the tuition and fee piece of this. They are receiving their funds on time for the colleges. I will say the important piece with the schools is basically making sure we have accounted for all branch and satellite locations, so that way when it's time to flip the switch, that we're able to quickly pay students. So we are working closely with schools right now to make sure that we're accounting for all their locations where a student could potentially be residing at and taking the majority of their courses, so we can pay them on time when it comes December 1st.
And just out of curiosity, how many schools are you all dealing with? How many separate institutions are you all having to deal
There's
with?
over 14,000 VA-approved schools.
14,000.
Correct.
Wow. Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. If there are no further questions, we can begin to bring this hearing to a close. I want to thank Chairwoman Lee, Ranking Members Bill Arrakis and Banks, of course, Dr. Rowe, our subcommittee members, and our expert witnesses who've joined us today to testify. Well, things haven't gone smoothly with Forever GI Bill implementation. It's important to remember we all share the same goal, as has been said many times, and that's to provide veterans with the benefits that they've earned. That's why we're here. One of the things that we learned is that in the last 18 months of implementation that we have to take control of this process and define targets along the way to prevent the same mishaps from happening again. I'm encouraged to the extent that I've heard that that's occurring. Also encouraged to hear the Undersecretary reiterate the comments of Ms. Devlin that you are 100% certain, 10 out of 10, that these issues will be rectified by the end of the year. We'll be following up to make sure that's the case. I welcomed Mr. Rowe's suggestion, or Dr. Rowe's suggestion of another hearing on this matter, and we'll be following up if we believe that to be appropriate. And my staff, along with the committee, will be reviewing the Accenture contract, which I have heard is quite voluminous, several thousands of pages, and we'll undoubtedly have more questions as we read that contract and as our staff digs into this for you, our witnesses. So I hope that the Department, along with the Inspector General and MITRE, will remain responsive to us and available to us, and I'm very grateful for that. With that, I'll say that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include additional materials. Again, I thank everyone for coming, and without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.